Okay, well, let's get started. May well be a few people who join us once we get underway, but that's okay. Welcome everybody to the last DEI seminar of 2024. Still allows me to celebrate before the break. I'm delighted today to, in case any of you don't know me, I'm Simone Abram. I'm the director of the Durham Energy Institute. And I'm very pleased today to welcome Pedro Fonseca from Brazil, who is an energy lawyer in Brazil's, I'm going to say this wrong, but I will do my best, Julião Coelho law firm. Is that near enough? Which is a really renowned law firm and he works in energy, natural resources, power, where he's senior partner and head of litigation. And his work has led him very much into international interdisciplinary approaches because it's a very fast evolving area of law. So we're really pleased that he is here to talk to us today, and he will speak for about 30-40 minutes and then we'll have questions. If you want to put questions in the chat as we go along, you're more than welcome. And you can ask questions through the chat or in person at the end of the seminar. So I'm going to hand over to Pedro. If you want to say a little bit more about yourself by way of introduction, that would be fine. Over to you. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Pedro Fonseca. I'm a lawyer in Brazil. I work with energy law. I have been working with it for the past 15 years. And this has also been my topic of study, including at Stanford. And I'm here to talk a little about how to mitigate climate risk and how we have done it here in Brazil with our energy relocating mechanism. I'm sure you are all energy enthusiasts because you're joining this seminar at this time of the year. So let's try to just have some fun and a good conversation. I'm going to share my screen here. Do you see?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Okay. So just. Just to give a very brief idea of what is the mechanism, the energy reallocating mechanism, in a very brief glimpse, it's an energy sharing mechanism between hydropower generators only, in which they share hydrological risk by supporting one another when during low precipitation periods. So in order to explain it in detail how it works and the challenges it faces, we will go through this roadmap here. With that idea in mind, and don't worry, we're going to get into detail. We just start this conversation by understanding why the mechanism is useful, which brings us to comment a little about climate risk. And I know this audience here better than anyone else is aware, if not an expert on climate change. But what I want to quickly point is that climate change imposes climate risk. Every country is subject to it, to more extreme weather events, flooding, droughts, hurricanes, and so on. But what has changed in the last decade or so is that finally the debate is moving from academia to economic forums. And I think a great breakthrough, at least in the narrative in this topic, was the belated but obvious conclusion that climate risk is financial risk. Since 2016, at least, the World Bank is advising economists all over the world about this. The World Economic Forum has also highlighted climate risk as financial risk. On its last report, they have ranked global risks by severity for the economies in the next 10 years, and all first four are related to climate risk. And this became mainstream when BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink, started pointing out on his annual letters to investors that there would be a significant shift in how money is allocated considering climate risk. So now we have data specifying the damages of climate risk. And this is revealing by itself. This data is important because now governments and entities, they start weighting and comparing the costs of mitigating measures versus the costs of damages. Here we see OECD classifying and quantifying the damages over the years. It's no different in the UK, of course, it's all over the world. Here's just a representation of the costs related to climate damage regarding the country's GDP. So in the current policy scenario, it's expected that 7.4% of the UK's GDP is attached to climate damage. And even if in a strong policies of mitigation scenario, it still would consume 2.5% of UK's GDP on this century. And every economic sector suffers climate damages, but the energy sector, and especially the generation sector, is more affected. And within the generation sector, I would say hydroelectric is the most vulnerable because the water cycle is the first and most sensitive to change. What I want to highlight here is that climate risk encompasses not only extreme weather events with catastrophic damage, but also the increase in unpredictability of the normal regime, what we constantly call the new normal. So with this increase in unpredictability, especially of water cycles, it's harder to plan, to finance, to build, and to operate in hydroelectric power plant. And so there's a vicious cycle because in order to fight climate change, we need to increase the use of renewables, but climate change is also an obstacle for renewables in the sense that it increases unpredictability for us to implement them. So again, here just an illustration of how hydropower is vulnerable to changes in the water cycle. On the left, we can see how the projected annual average precipitation levels may change in Brazil, considering the different pathways in our efforts to reduce global warming. And on the right, just a projection showing that pretty much everywhere where there is a hydropower plant, dam, is also affected. And the same goes for all renewables. For all renewables, heat waves are associated with a decrease in expected wind levels. The same goes for solar because radiation patterns changes, considering if, for example, the rainy season goes longer than expected. Even thermoelectric power plants are affected. If we consider biomass, of course, there's no doubt because plantations are very sensitive to weather as well. But even fossil fueled power plants, which are considered to be the most reliable, they have their production decreased by climate change because the water and air that is needed to cool the engines, if they become too warm, they can decrease the capacity of these power plants. A study shows, for example, that a global temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius would decrease 4.5% of thermal power plants capacity. So just to wrap up, climate risk brings uncertainty to all stages of the project of implementing a power plant. For planning and development, models cannot be fully trusted because no one can tell for sure that the future will reflect the past anymore. And the construction phase as well, because the events can delay the construction or even increase its costs. For financing as well, because it increases the cost of capital or maybe even make it impossible. And in the operation phase also because there's definitely a loss of revenue associated to the unpredictability. What are the alternatives, if any, regarding this risk? Well, the first scenario is that the project just becomes unfeasible and the investor drops out. The risk is too high, and then the project is abandoned, which is bad because the renewable power plant would not be implemented. In the second scenario, the investor would take the risk and bear the cost, but of course it would be passed on to the consumer. And this is a bad alternative because when the developer cannot control the risk, they tend to classify it in a very conservative way, considering the worst case scenario and the maximum damage that they can suffer. So considering that they sign long-term contracts for 20, 30 years, it means that this cost internalization is perennial during the whole contract, regardless whether the event happened in the worst case scenario or not. So it means the consumer will be paying over 30 years for a very high risk, to compensate a very high risk. Another alternative would be to hire insurance, which also has a high associated cost, which is also internalized and passed on to the consumer. And there's a protection gap because insurers just won't take a certain level of risk. When the risk is too high, insurance companies won't accept the insurance. There's another form of insurance, which is has the same problems, which is the parametric insurance. The only difference is that it is not triggered by the losses associated with the event, but by objective data that describes the event. For example, if precipitation levels falls below a certain level, then the compensation is due, regardless of the effective damage that suffered. So this is a form of insurance that is faster in terms of compensation, but it brings the same costs and risks. Just to illustrate that what happened in Uruguay, there's a state-owned company, UTE, that is responsible for more than 80% of the country's production. And it has signed a parametric insurance contract. And it is the same as the example I gave. If precipitation levels falls below a certain level, then they receive compensation. But a common challenge for all these alternatives is that climate risk is very difficult, if not impossible, to price. So even in any of these scenarios, there is still a risk that may goes beyond what was expected. So another alternative is the mechanism we've implemented here in Brazil. But even before going into that, it's important to understand the Brazilian electricity matrix, so we can understand why it is important here, and also to understand why the Brazilian case is worth being studied. Brazil has one of the cleanest and most renewable electrical matrices in the world, with almost 90% of its electricity coming from renewable sources, while the average in the world is about 28%. This is definitely something to be proud of, considering Brazil has 250 million people. There are, of course, countries with an even higher percentage of renewables in their matrix, for example, like Norway, New Zealand, or Uruguay, but they have a much smaller population, something between 3 and 5 million people. So it has been a great achievement here in Brazil to supply renewable energy for such a big population. And considering that electrification is a great pillar of the energy transition and decarbonization, the matrix needs to be clean for this to happen. And when we look into this 90% of renewables here in Brazil, more than 60% of it comes from hydropower, followed by 14% of wind, 8% of biomass, 7% of solar. So let's see some other factors that contributed for this achievement here in renewables. One key factor is Brazil's continental size. Here we can see the country overlaid to Europe on a true scale, without the distortion that the classic world map often displays. It basically covers Europe entirely, the Mediterranean Sea, the Baltic Sea, North Sea, and even a considerable part of Russia. So having a continental size contributes in two ways. First, it means the country is rich in renewable resources because it has a large area to explore. And secondly, it means the country covers different microclimate regimes, which are complementary to each other. When we look into hydro, again, it represents more than 60% of the installed capacity here in Brazil. This is very important because the country can explore different and complementary hydrological regimes. Here on the right, we can see a representation of the potential from hydropower throughout the year in Brazil. Although the potential in general is lower on the second semester and higher in the first semester, we can see the complementarity between the regions. Each line here is a region of the country, and especially between north and south, there's a big gap that shows the complementarity. Another factor is that the country is highly interconnected by long transmission lines, and this allows Brazil to explore the renewable resource where it is and to transport the energy to where the consumer is. Interconnection is fundamental for intermittent renewable sources like solar, wind, and even run-of-river hydro, the ones without reservoir, because they can store fuel or energy, so the energy must be consumed immediately. And this wouldn't be possible without interconnection. Besides, the country has a single independent system operator, which is key to coordinating the dispatch of all power plants in a single order of economic optimization. So there's no system fragmentation and only one decision-making entity. And this is also possible because energy law here in Brazil is federal law. So every player follows the same rules. There is only one spot market, only one clearing price, and so on. Okay, so with this in mind, we can start talking a little more in detail about the energy reallocating mechanism, which is definitely another factor that contributed to Brazil's highly renewable electrical matrix. So first, let's understand where it came from. Before 1990, almost every asset, power plant, utility here in Brazil was owned by Eletrobras, which was a state-owned company. And the company already managed hydrological risk within its own portfolio, which was very large. So when an Eletrobras power plant was unable to generate enough energy to meet its contracts, the company would use any spare energy it had from another power plant of its own to fulfill its commercial obligations. So in 1990, when the market went through a reform, bringing liberalization and competition, the company was worried about hydrological risk. It estimated that one of its power plants would suffer a $140 million loss monthly because of it couldn't make this arrangement anymore. So Eletrobras used its lobby power to impose by law the same risk-sharing mechanism it used before. So what was a company strategy until then became public policy. The law was approved in 1998, so the mechanism has been used for 26 years now. It's mandatory for all hydroelectric power plants bigger than 30 megawatts. And the purpose is to mitigate seasonality, mitigate the outlying events that can affect a specific region, mitigate rainfall pattern variation, low precipitation levels, and therefore create a more stable revenue flow. So in short, the mechanism serves to share hydrological risk only. It doesn't cover financial risks, individual risks, performance risks, or physical damages. For example, if the power plant suffers any problem on its engines, if it has a strike of its workers, none of this is covered by the mechanism, of course. What is covered is hydrological risk, and the original concept is deeply related to rainfall pattern variation. So here's a representation of how it works. Every hydroelectric generator production is allocated to a pool, and each participant receives a share of this pool based on its firm energy, regardless of what their individual production was on that given period. So firm energy is the parameter for the allocated quota for this division, this sharing. And it's basically the product between the installed capacity versus the capacity factor. But it's calculated in a very conservative way, considering the capacity factor. So the amount of energy that is expected to be produced is met even on the worst hydrological scenario ever registered until then, until the moment the firm energy was calculated. So this means the mechanism was built on the premise that every participant should be able to meet its firm energy and even have a surplus because of this conservative way it was calculated. And this, the surplus would be donated to another power plant that momentarily couldn't reach its firm energy due to hydrological factors. So again, the system is based on seasonality, and this means that the positions of giver and receiver, donator and receiver in the mechanism, they tend to invert when a power plant goes from wet season to dry season. So one donates to another, but these positions tends to invert when the regime changes. And this is how it's based. Just to wrap up here, so all hydroelectrical generators, they are subject to the centralized dispatch by the ISO. Each power plant has its firm energy set based on installed capacity and capacity factor in a very conservative way. The operator measures the total output of the mechanism, and then each power plant gets an allocated quota based again on its firm energy and not on its production. So this creates a more stable revenue flow for investors, and that's how it fosters renewables. So there are also control measures, because one could argue that a power plant could just not make any effort or even go offline and just receive its allocated quota. So there would be a free rider on the mechanism. To avoid that, power plants go through a review of their firm energy levels every 5 years. And this considers their effective history of production. So if a power plant is failing to meet its firm energy, after 5 years, it will be reviewed. So this means for the next 5 years, it will be receiving a lower allocated quota. Another measure is that every power plant that receives energy from the mechanism pays an optimization tariff to the giver, to the power plant that donated. And this tariff is based on, is priced to cover all marginal costs. So the idea is that the power plant that received energy will pay the same amount of the cost it would incur to produce that energy. So it neutralizes the effect. So with these two measures, in theory, the mechanism should be neutral and assure that every power plant makes its best to contribute for the whole pool. Just the concepts we talked about, we can go over that. Okay, so we've seen how the mechanism works. It has definitely played an important role in fostering new hydropower plants in Brazil, new investments, but also in keeping the existing plants alive during tough periods. But there are, of course, problems that come with it and challenges the mechanism just can't handle. Especially in recent years, with the rise in climate risk, the mechanism has started to face new challenges. So let's talk a little about them. As we've seen, the mechanism was conceived to allow that every participant is able to meet its firm energy and even have a surplus, because again, the firm energy is calculated in a very conservative way. So a very objective way to measure how the mechanism's performance is performing is to calculate the ratio between the total amount of energy that was produced and the total sum of the firm energy. This ratio is called the generation scaling factor, the GSF. And it basically means if GSF is higher than 1, it means the mechanism is overperforming, which is what was expected to happen. It means it's producing more than 100% of the total firm energy of the power plants. If GSF is lower than 1, it means the mechanism is underperforming and the global production is lower than 100%. For example, if GSF is 0.9, it means the mechanism is producing 90% of what it could produce. What we've seen in the last 2 decades or so is that the mechanism is not being able to meet the firm energy. Here we see the comparison between the total firm energy, the expected production, and the effective generation. And as we can see, since 2014, the whole pool is systematically underperforming, failing to meet its energy needs. So the red here represents the deficit, which is the energy not delivered that has to be purchased in the spot market so the contracts can be fulfilled. Again, let's remember that the firm energy is calculated considering the worst hydrological scenario ever registered until then. So this means that since 2014, every year since then has been worse in terms of hydrological regime with lower precipitation levels than any year before. When the firm energy was calculated. So this is shocking. It means that since 2014, the whole mechanism of hydroelectric power plants in Brazil is producing less than it was expected in the worst hydrological regime ever registered until then. So the challenge is that the mechanism will still help power plants below average, but it won't solve the problem if the whole pool is suffering, right? It doesn't mean the mechanism doesn't work anymore, that it's gone. If we could zoom in this blue line here, which is the effective production, we would see several power plants being rescued, but it just won't solve this structural and bigger problem. So because of that, in 2015, a new law was approved to include a new layer of protection to generators, which is a form of insurance to cover the risk of the difference between the total firm energy and the effective production. The cost, of course, is allocated to the consumer, but the generator in exchange pays a premium for that. So the premium is paid regardless of the mechanism result, but consumers, on the other hand, they pay for the difference in the spot market if GSF is lower than 1, but they also receive credits if there's any surplus or if GSF is higher than 1. So after 2015, the mechanism became a hybrid model, including the traditional energy sharing mechanism plus this insurance over it. Okay, so beside this big challenge, the mechanism faces other problems and disputes arising inside of it. A major case occurred when generators went to court to argue that their low levels of production was not related to hydrological risk, but to governmental acts that prevented them to fulfill their contracts. For example, they argued that the operator was dispatching more thermoelectric power plants, breaking the economic order of dispatch. They were using standby power plants to meet ordinary demand, and that there were delays in the construction of transmission lines, preventing them from exporting their production. So they filed multiple lawsuits requiring a limitation to the GSF. This is only to give context to the lawsuit, but the problem is how the injunctions were enforced. Several generators had their injunctions granted, but the problem is that the mechanism is a zero-sum game. One player's gain is necessarily another player's loss because the amount of energy available to share is given. It doesn't change. So if a participant gets a bigger allocated quota, another will have a smaller one. And the participant without an injunction would bear this cost, donating more of its energy to others. So there was a domino effect. Every generator had to go to court to get the same injunction because it was suffering the same governmental problems, but it would do so to neutralize its peers' injunction, and not necessarily because it wanted to argue that in court. So this was a leading case in the sense that generators realized there was a loophole for easier injunctions rather than seeking direct compensation from the government. And after that, judicialization levels within the mechanism arose. What was truly a cooperative system became a competitive one after this. Other cases of litigation involve the debate of what is hydrological risk. In this case, for example, the Candonga power plant became silted up because a dam upstream the river collapsed. It was a mining dam, and a huge amount of water, mud, and sediments made its generation impossible. The generator argued in court that the event was hydrological risk because it was the huge mass of water that blocked its dam. The generator got an injunction for a period, and it was enough for the case to be settled with an agreement. But personally, I believe here it should be excluded from the hydrological risk, but it wasn't related to that. Just to illustrate another case, it happened this year in Brazil. One generator's dam collapsed, and it was due to torrential rains that happened in southern Brazil. This is still an ongoing case, but here I personally believe it can be treated as hydrological risk because although the original concept is related to low precipitation levels, it was definitely the rain itself that caused the physical damage. And just to be clear, they don't ask the mechanism to pay for the physical damage, but only to keep giving the generator its allocated quota while the production is temporarily impossible. Another problem within the mechanism is that there are players who are systematically below average, which means they never invert position to donate something to the mechanism, and others who are systematically above average. So the control measures that I mentioned, they are not 100% effective because there are limitations of how much a power plant's firm energy can be reviewed at once. So it takes several of those 5-year steps to neutralize this inefficiency. So this is a distortion that efficient players unfortunately have to bear within the mechanism. So we are reaching the end of this discussion, and I just wanted to put some reflections and final thoughts. Is the mechanism a good idea? Should it be expanded? Should it be reformed? Should it be extinct? And one debate is whether it should be expanded for solar and wind, for example. They face similar climate risks, of course, especially wind, but it's harder to establish a complementary regime between geographic regions like it is for water, because seasonality is not as present for wind and solar as it is for the water regime. Another idea is to not create a new mechanism for those sources, but to include them in the existing mechanism, so that all renewable sources would share their production and therefore the risk. In Brazil, radiation levels for solar are pretty flat over the year, but wind and hydro are vary significantly, and they are complementary to each other. As we can see here in the gray and blue lines, this means that the idea of expanding it to wind or including wind inside the mechanism is possible. So to end the discussion, here are some final reflections. The first is whether the mechanism should be mandatory. Of course, if it wasn't, all efficient generators would drop out and only underperforming participants would stay. But I think the energy sharing could also be implemented by multilateral contracts, so that each generator can manage their own hydrological risk and choose with each other generators they want to contract and share the risk. The second is the question of whether the mechanism imposes more risks than it mitigates, especially given the rising in litigation and the zero-sum problem that I mentioned. I don't think there's a right answer to that. But finally, and third, I personally believe that the mechanism has played a crucial role for hydropower here in Brazil. Without it, many power plants would not have endured during tough periods, during tough hydrological times, and we would not have a renewable matrix like we do. But I believe the mechanism needs some reforms after 26 years. But it should not be abandoned. I would like very much to hear from you, see if any of you had ever heard of it or knows of any other country that does something similar. And I'm eager to hear your reflections as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. That was really fascinating. So it was very interesting to compare what happens in different countries. So, yeah, as Pedro says, we'll open for questions. Please either put your hand up, put your video on, put something in the chat, and you're welcome to ask about anything from the talk today. Give people a minute to absorb and reflect, I think. Yep, Jean-Miguel. Please go ahead and ask a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I will introduce myself. I'm Professor João Miguel from the University of Campinas, São Paulo, Brazil. I'm a coordinator of the Lab of Energy and Environmental Studies here in the University of Campinas. And congratulations, Pedro, for your interesting case study. And I would like to know what you think about the two questions about the present energy transition in Brazil. First is the massive increase of solar energy in Brazil, how this will impact all the system. And the second question is about the opening of the free market in 2025 that will reach the group B, and the expansion of the free market will impact the mechanism and all the system as you show the implications and how it related with the climate change impacts. Just these two few questions, if you could answer or react.
Great, thank you very much, Jean. Well, first about the expansion of solar. We have seen in the last years that both wind and solar are the majority of the new installed capacity, because of course it's cheaper. The LCOE, the levelized cost of energy for those sources, is lower than the others. But there's a planning problem too, because the operator and I mean the system as a whole has to consider all attributes of the energy sources, right? Not only the price. So these, especially wind and solar, they are intermittent, which means the system also needs reliability, also needs flexibility. So we are not going to be able to drop thermal. Brazil has a good point that great part of its thermal capacity comes from biomass. So the impact is reduced. We know it's not totally neutral, but it's much better than a fossil fuel power plant. And a problem that comes with this flooding from solar and wind is curtailment, because they are very concentrated in some areas. They create this curtailment on the grid. So the challenge now is to have a grid expansion, transmission line expansions, in order to embrace all this new installed capacity. I think this is the challenge all over the world. We were just talking about this. The cost of renewables, they're very low now. This is something great for the energy transition, but now we have to focus on planning the grid expansion as well. Your second point about opening the market, the free market in Brazil, I think it's something very good. I have actually written about that at Stanford. And my point is that the more the consumer has to choose, the bigger the liberty, they tend to go into renewables. So when we're talking about the free market, the consumer wants carbon credits, they want carbon renewable certificates, especially big companies that are with ESG guidelines. So I think the market opening tends to increase the pace in our energy transition. But of course, there are challenges regarding tariffs and how costs are allocated, because there are long-term commitments that were made by utilities considering its current market size. So when there is a huge shift into the free market, those costs which remain the same, they are allocated into less people, less captive consumers. So they individually start paying more for the same service. So this is also a challenge that has to be planned in order to these consumers that are shifting into the free market to take with themselves part of the cost of the investments that were made when they were captive consumers.
Thank you. That's interesting. I'm wondering something else, which is you would at face value, you would imagine that in a country where the majority of the generation is hydropower, that you would have no difficulty with storage, that you would not have to curtail, because, I mean, in the UK, for example, we're putting in pumped storage for precisely that reason, to try and avoid curtailment. So why is it that this is such a big issue? Is it because of the regional variations? Is it because of a large amount of that is run of river, or could you just explain a little bit more on why? I mean, you've shown, other than what you've already shown us, how come you haven't got the best battery in the world with all those pumped storage stations?
Yeah, thank you, Simone. The older hydroelectric power plants, they are the traditional ones with big reservoirs. And this is why hydro plays such an important role in Brazil, because it's renewable, but it also has the attributes of being dispatchable, being flexible because of the reservoir. But the new power plants that were built, I would say, in the last 20 years or so, they are mostly run of river, because the environmental impact to build a power plant with a reservoir is much bigger. The cost of construction, the environmental licensing is very hard. And many of these potentials are in the north region where the Amazon is. So there is a huge debate and resistance in building new power plants with reservoirs. The last big case, for example, was Belo Monte, which is a huge power plant. I think it's the fourth biggest in the world. And it's in the Amazon region. So the original project was to be a power plant with a reservoir, but because of all these disputes, it became a run-of-river power plant. It is still a huge hydroelectric power plant, but it lost this attribute. So we have storage because of the given reservoir that already exists, but we do not have a policy for storage itself. The agency, for example, is debating this right now. So 2025 will probably be the year where we will have storage auctions, for example, for the first time. And this can people can participate with any source, any kind of storage, even pump hydro, batteries, traditional batteries. But this is going to happen for the first time. And the problem with curtailment is that they are very concentrated in some areas, because all investors went to the best place for radiation levels, the best place for wind. So this created this problem on the grid. It's that they are not well distributed over the country. So the existing transmission lines did not follow the pace of the renewable expansion of these sources.
I see. Yeah, and the other thing I was going to ask you was about this. Did you say it was a 30 megawatt threshold for participation? Can you tell us something about the significance of that threshold? And on two things. One is like what the significance of moving it up or down is, and the other is what protection is there for the smaller generators who are under the threshold, if any?
Yeah, it's mandatory for hydroelectric power plants above 30 megawatts, but it's optional for the ones that are smaller than it. So every hydroelectric power plant could participate in the mechanism, but the thing is that the bigger ones, bigger than 30 megawatts, they must. Otherwise, they could interfere in the dispatch. So in order to give this predictability and stability for the operator, and also to keep the mechanism interesting for its participants. As I said, if it was optional, or if the threshold was very higher, maybe efficient power plants would just opt out, and they, for example, when they are starting their operation, they might want to share the risk because they don't know the result yet. But after 5 or 10 years, when they know how the operation is going, they can just see if they need the mechanism or not, and then drop out or stay. But if you give this option, the mechanism collapses because only bad ones would want to share, and it wouldn't work.
That's interesting. Thank you. Does anyone else like to pose a question or make a comment? While you're thinking about it, I'm going to then ask him another question, which is to ask whether there are any similar mechanisms in any other countries that could be compared, just out of interest.
Yeah, that's something I would like to also hear from you if you know any, because I personally don't know any other experience similar to this. When it was created here, there was a study to understand what could be implemented here in Brazil. But again, it came from something that already existed as a company policy in Eletrobras. So it was something that the company was already doing itself, and then it just wanted it to keep happening for other participants. So it was something that happened naturally. I mean, naturally in the sense that it was already happening. But I personally don't know of any other country.
And do you think it's had a significant effect on the price the consumer pays for electricity?
Yeah, I mean, there is a cost associated to this energy sharing mechanism because some power plants could just use their surplus to increase their profits and maybe reduce prices. But on the other hand, it prevents going into the spot market where prices are very volatile. So there are both ways. They impose a cost which is hard to specify, but they also prevent a risk of volatility in the spot market.
Can't see any hands up, but feel free to ask questions, everybody. I think maybe there are people here who know more about contracts for difference and how they might compare in terms of the benefits and disadvantages. No, I think everyone is very quiet today. There's space for questions if anyone would like to ask anything. Claire, do you want to ask a question?
Hi, thanks, Simon. Yeah, I just wondered, thanks, Pedro. It's really fascinating, your presentation. Thank you very much. Just because I'm a policy fellow for the Clean Maritime Research Hub that's led out of Durham University. It's a national, UK national programme. But obviously an area of interest is marine fuels and the way that Brazil obviously might be able to contribute with decarbonised marine fuels and production of things like ammonia and methanol. So I just wondered if you've got and how that might impact on Brazil's domestic demand going forward.
Well, thank you. Brazil has always been a great researcher and developer of these technologies. I mean, since 1970s, we already use ethanol as fuel for transportation and for many uses. So I believe the focus here has been around biofuels. Coming from sugarcane, corn, and so on, because the country also has a great potential in agriculture. So I personally, I'm not aware of anything regarding marine fuels, but we are exploring methane from trash, and also from cow and cattle production, which is a byproduct. But the majority of biofuels come from this research in sugarcane and corn.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think it's probably time to say thank you very much, Pedro. That was really interesting. We will just top and tail the recording and share it with people. I think there will be other people beyond this group today in the university and in the Energy Institute who will be interested to learn more about this. So we look forward to keeping in touch with you. Thank you very much indeed for the fascinating seminar today. And we look forward to seeing everybody in next term when we restart the seminar list. Thank you very much.